So the next marathon I'm going to be doing is a big franchise that has ultimately come to an end very recently, even though it's really coming to an end very soon, and I am going to be talking about that movie when it comes out, which of course this marathon will be leading up into that movie. But mainly, it's kind of done. More or less it's been done for a while. Kind of. Sort of. It's weird. So of course superhero movies have evolved in and of themselves throughout time. Originally, superheroes were only thought as weird, goofy things for kids, until stuff like Tim Burton's Batman and just comics themselves getting very edgy eventually told all of us that comics could very much still be for the people that read them originally back in the 60s and 70s who are now fully adults by that point. And even more so for the even older people from the 30s and 40s. Superhero comics have been around for a long time, 80, near 90 years to this point. So there's a lot of history you could draw from to make into movies, and adaptations have been made since around the 50s. And at around the point of the 90s, things were slowly getting a little bit sloppy. They weren't as popular, but due to stuff like The Matrix bringing back action films with big dramatic characters back into the fray, superhero movies were starting to come back into fashion, especially because we're at it around this point. Marvel was dealing with certain legal troubles, which are their whole own tale all on their own. But let's say they basically got fucked due to the people that were inside the company in of itself and certain deals they made, which then had to result in them making more deals to make up for that lost money. The 90s wasn't a great time for comics. There were some good stories, but there also were fucking terrible ones. But also due to the fact that the way they made their comics kind of just ruined the way certain people could even enjoy comics. Resulted in a big crash which fucked over a lot of companies, but especially Marvel, and it's taken a while for these companies to even get back. Dark Horse, IDW, thankfully still exist. DC mostly exists thanks to Warner Brothers, and Marvel mainly is able to still exist because of Disney. But it was because of certain deals like selling off the movie rights to certain companies that was able to keep them afloat for at least a little while. They of course sold the Blade and Spider-Man rights, and those companies got onto it immediately. Universal sat on Hulk for a little while, but to go alongside the other two that did jump onto it, Fox jumped right on into X-Men. There's a lot to draw from, especially with X-Men, especially at around this point where a whole bunch had happened recently to make for a really great movie. This resulted in the movie we have now, the beginning of the X-Men movie franchise. A franchise that should probably have not went on as long as it has. For as annually as it's been releasing, it's a surprise that ever... Yeah, we later got the MCU, but that was a much bigger project that they only were able to start doing after they had only recently began to really come out of their financial troubles, and then was only really able to continue doing and be even bigger and bigger because of their Disney buyout. Universal never really wanted anything to do with Hulk after they basically fucked it over just the first time doing it. Whole other story on there. I would love to review Ang Lee's Hulk eventually. But certain other companies tried their superheroes for one movie, maybe two, and Blade was lucky to get its third before going, nobody really wants it. Fuck even Sony, when they worked with Spider-Man, even though they're still holding on to it, because they do see the potential in it, still basically took big giant breaks when people revealed that they really hated what they've been doing with Spider-Man. But Fox, even more so than Sony before their eventual buyout, also by Disney, kept on to the X-Men franchise, just holding it forever so that Marvel would never get its grasp on it. And this was never really a problem before the MCU really started to be a thing, and they really started to get back all of their rights to Ghost Rider and Daredevil and all of that. And during the early days of the MCU, the X-Men were really trying to contend with the other Marvel properties, to be its own big franchise. This has resulted in a whole bunch of different changes to this franchise, and what it really started with is not what it eventually became. Like, even a couple movies after this is an entirely different kind of movie than what this movie was. And eventually, as we get to more modern times, boy, are we just in an entirely different area. Of course, Fox producers got the usual suspects, director Bryan Singer on the project, alongside getting fucking Solid Snake himself to write the movie. Like, I went most of my life not knowing that Solid Snake wrote X-Men. Like, what? Till right now, I've seen this movie a few times, and I had not known until right now that David Hayter wrote this fucking movie. That's so weird. Of course, these guys weren't the first choice, because originally Brett Ratner and even Paul W.S. Anderson were supposed to come on and direct this movie, which, I wouldn't have minded seeing what Paul W.S. Anderson would have done. That would have been some crazy shit. This, of course, being the 2000s, was when people really tried to modernize things and make them be more realistic, which I've mentioned in the past that it is very much a thing you can do and make it look good. We've seen through the recent Marvel films that you can have comic book-like designs, and while you can't have, sure, the 60s and 70s type designs, but that's not what comics were looking like at the time. You could have easily taken what comic books looked in the 90s and put that on screen. I mean, I'm not in the crazy, muscly, teeth-gritty type shit that, like, certain artists were doing, but you could have the more recent modern designs on to screen, and that would have been perfectly fine. Spider-Man being around the time of X-Men goes to directly show you that that kind of thought of, oh, what were you expecting, yellow spandex, is the wrong way of thinking. And thankfully, we have this kind of design work going on now. While the MCU would still kind of have this idea of have it be a little bit more modern, a little bit more realistic than the crazy Norse shit, which results in certain movies not being as great as they could have easily been, Thor. But even in the early days, they try at least a little bit more than the X-Men tried, which was just not doing at all. Strangely, the effects company that was in a whole bunch of 90s and early 2000s movies at around this point did not help make the effects of this movie, but they did hire a whole other company, that being Digital Domain, which of course helped make the pretty good effects in this movie. The effects aren't too obvious in this movie. It's mainly practical, just dudes jumping around, definitely some wire stuff going on. But there's certain crazy particles that fly all over the place, and of course Wolverine's claws are definitely, CGI. Supervisor Mike Fink is actively not too proud of the effects. That's understandable. They don't look all that great. They're just kind of shapes, like a lot of the other particles I mentioned before just feel like random stuff they put on screen. The Wolverine's claws look fine even all these years later, but, they're obviously not on him. And a certain part later, and when a certain character looks a certain way, doesn't look all that great, kind of looks a little bit weird. But then again, that kind of helps in the scene of it looking more creepy. What doesn't look creepy is Toad's fucking tongue, which is very clearly him opening his mouth and then adding a tongue. Yeah. Being that John Williams couldn't score it, which Fox wanted to, for obvious reasons, instead Bryan Singer got his own composer that he worked with in several movies, that being John Ottoman, who did help to bring this movie into this cool, action-packed feel throughout it. Oh, sorry. Never mind. Fox wanted John Williams on this movie for, I'd assume, because of Star Wars, but ultimately John Williams was doing something else. Bryan Singer was going to bring in John Ottoman, but due to the fact that production was moved to a couple months later, John Ottoman was then helping in Urban Legends, so he couldn't help out. So they got Michael Kamen, who said he's also a very notable composer as well. He is pretty good. I do like the music that is in here. It does make this movie feel very action-packed and very of its era. Less of a superhero film and more of a 2000s action film, He tries to really move with Singer's action scenes and less try to be this superhero film style. So with the fact that one of the producers is Richard Donner's wife, Lauren Schuler Donner, we have their company coming on to help the movie alongside Bryan Singer's own company. Big production help them make as much crazy stuff as they possibly can. Thus, you get X-Men. X-Men is very similar to the main X-Men movies. It's all about the main group of mutants, which are just kind of humans that are naturally born with superpowers that to kind of just come after they hit puberty, more or less. Humans are not too into this idea, and they're starting to kind of push back on the mutants, and that's resulting in lots of mutants either kind of getting angry about this idea or going into hiding, and some of these people joining, of course, either Magneto's side. Him and his Brotherhood are a group of people who are trying to fight the humans and get ready for this seeming human-mutant war. Or they'll hopefully join Charles Xavier and his school, which will teach mutants to use their powers for good, and the exact opposite of what Magneto's trying to do. One of these mutants being scared of their powers, of course we begin off the movie with Rogue, whose name isn't Rogue, but mainly we'll call her Rogue. She, like in the comics, has the power to basically absorb other people's powers simply by touching them. It has to be skin-on-skin contact, thus the reason why when she happens to hit puberty and starts trying to make out with her boyfriend, she nearly fucking kills the guy. In the comics, it isn't quite, like, visceral looking, but it's a similar effect. It's not great for the person that she, like, absorbs the power of. A bit of the memory and a bit of the, like, personality of that character. Rogue kind of fluctuates as a character throughout the comics, and I guess a bit into the movies as well. And she runs off and eventually finds herself in this bar on buttfuck nowhere, where, of course, at this point, Hugh Jackman's famous Wolverine happens to be beating up some dude. At this point, Wolverine does not know who he is, so he's just kind of traveling, trying to figure out where he is. And after beating up some dudes in a bar, he gets revealed to the rest of the people there that he is, of course, a mutant, with crazy big metal claws. Rogue, kind of seeing that they're similar weirdos, decides to kind of follow him as they're hit by a tree that at first seems like they hit it, but was very clearly done by a certain someone. That certain someone being Sabretooth, who in this is just kind of a crazy feral monster man, a little bit more complex in the comics. And from what we later see in movies, definitely not just this, but apparently he, like, devolves into this just beast man. Before Wolverine and Rogue are something by Sabretooth, they're saved by Storm and Cyclops, who, of course, I don't really know what they were doing. I guess they happened to get an alert to bring them to the X-Mansion, mainly the underground part of it. Jean Grey, that of course being the Phoenix or Marvel Gore or whatever. She's trying to check up on Wolverine. Ultimately, Wolverine kind of just like, duh, eventually going up on the upper floors and finding that it's just kind of a regular school. Ultimately, he's introduced to Charles Xavier, who fully introduces him to the other X-Men and reveals, what I just said about what Charles Xavier is trying to do. It's a really cool montage how he does talk about all of this stuff while also showing some of the cool, crazy mutant shit that we can do. I do like the show don't tell way of doing stuff, but if you're going to have a character go through some kind of monologue or some exposition, I would prefer some actual visuals which help us with that. Preferably helpful visuals that not only add to what they're talking about, but also add to the characters. This kind of montage is exactly what I'm looking for, rather than some kind of like slideshow when a character is talking about whatever they're doing. Lesser action films, especially like spy films or heist films. But I guess heist films are also a good case of what you could easily do when they're explaining their plan and them showing them actively do their plan. That's also a way of kind of explaining how that scene is. It's a good way to show the characters doing what the person's mentioning. Also got Xavier mentioning certain dates and times about when Wolverine lost his memory or when he met Magneto, which are not accurate to later movies. Oop. Thanks, timeline. You don't make any sense. As we get a look at this school, we also see Magneto and his Brotherhood kidnapping Senator Kelly, who is at this point really against mutants and is trying to find a way to kind of put them all on a list to find out where they are. He's kidnapped by Mystique, who pretended to be his subordinate person, and he's put through some weird kind of machine which slowly mutates him into some weird creature. This is what I mentioned before. Ultimately, he's found by the X-Men, and he kind of dies in their basement. He kind of just, like, flirps into some water. I think this does make sense that Magneto's machine definitely wouldn't turn people into mutants, because how would he know how to do that? And also I feel like Magneto would probably prefer to just, like, kill people off than just turn them all into mutants, really. That's because, as the movie shows very subtly throughout it, that Magneto has dealt with this very thing himself. The movie actively began with a scene of, like, during the fucking Holocaust, where a younger Magneto was being separated from his family. And it's a very subtle showing that he dealt with that kind of thing, as looking on his hand to see the numbers from during that time would imply that he is that same kid from the beginning scene. Obviously, a fan of the comics would know about Magneto and his past, but not knowing that, especially younger me as a kid, not knowing about the Holocaust had me actually pretty confused what that opening scene was. But if you don't know about X-Men, but you do know about real life stuff, that's a real good showing of having your villain seemingly be a lot more relatable than just some random megalomaniac, you know? Which is very cool. This movie has a lot of subtleties, and not just directly explaining to the viewer, trying to just show through the characters' actions and what they're dressed like and what they're trying to do to show off who they are and what their relationships to each other are. And that's really cool. I like how this movie doesn't just explain everything to you. Though in some ways it does kind of actively go against it, as I feel like Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Storm, even though they do stuff throughout the movie, I feel like we never really grow to learn who they are. We know enough about them throughout the movie to grow to like them and to want to see more, but not enough to really think they have some kind of arc throughout the movie. The movie is really just like Wolverine and Rogue and their friends, you know? Mystique, who I'm assuming because she happened to be an X-Men before, thanks to First Class, is able to easily sneak on the X-Mansion grounds and pretends to be Bobby Drake Iceman, whom Rogue was beginning to have a thing for, and he kind of convinces Rogue to just leave. Wolverine goes to try and find her, but this is ultimately revealed to be a trap, as Cyclops and Storm, who went with Wolverine, are taken out by Sabretooth and Toad, as Magneto just, like, throws Wolverine, because, you know, he's made out of fucking metal, and takes Rogue. As Professor X kind of figures out from Senator Kelly, you know, gooping out of existence, Magneto's going to use Rogue's power to absorb his stuff to allow her to use the machine, or I guess force her to make her use the machine, to ever die, to ultimately have it be such a big blast that it kills a lot of people. Or mutates them. I don't really know if Magneto knows that it's going to do one or the other. I'd imagine he knows it's going to kill them? Maybe, I don't know. So of course, the X-Men characters come up into the Empire State Building where Magneto happened to put her. I guess it's the most highest point of... Why the Empire State Building? Either way, Wolverine fights Mystique, who pretends to be him, which weirdly she's able to kind of, sort of replicate his claws, not entirely. While Toad weirdly has a good fight against Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Storm, to which, I mean, not a good fight, but like he causes them a lot more trouble than he probably should for just being Toad. Never seen again, except like in the past, during Days of Future Past, so I think he might have just died, not because of the lightning that Storm struck him with, but I think Toad just couldn't swim and drowned. Eventually Wolverine and the others do get to the top. Magneto kind of just stops them, but Wolverine is able to get himself out by kind of just stabbing himself. And with help of Wolverine finding Cyclops' visor, they're able to knock out Sabretooth, who doesn't show up in another movie, again, except for in the past, but he does kind of continue into the comics. A different thing I'll talk about in the next movie, but he's not quite dead yet. Very luckily, though, Wolverine, with a little help of Cyclops, is able to beat up Magneto and stop the big machine. Rogue was nearly killed during it, but thanks to Wolverine's healing factor, he is able to save her, and the process also gives her those very iconic white lines in her hair that'll vaguely be a thing in the other movies. The movie ends with Wolverine going off to deal with stuff in the North, which is also in the movie tie-in comics, as Magneto and Xavier have a really cool chess game, which I really like that Magneto would even allow a telepath to, like, even be in the same mind game as he would be in. But I guess that's a real good showing that they do respect each other enough that they know that wouldn't be a problem at all. And it just furthers the two of them as the other of the three main characters of the franchise. Xavier, Magneto, and Wolverine. And for the most part, all of them have some pretty cool arcs throughout the movies that kind of take them from one person and have them as a different at the end, but also is a really good beginning to a franchise. This singular movie, it's a very fun, neat adventure that has a beginning, middle, and end that's very satisfying and very entertaining throughout it. I don't really have a lot of problems with it. Its pacing is really good. It introduces the characters very nicely. I like the characters they introduce. They introduce a good amount. There's not too many X-Men all at once. And those who are important get more screen time than those who are lesser important. I do feel that there definitely could have been a little bit more of Cyclops, Storm, and Jean Grey, but we do get that in future movies, so that's perfectly fine. So ultimately, X-Men is a really good introduction to the X-Men. It's a fun adventure on its own, but it's definitely a beginning of a franchise. I can't be too mad that certain characters don't get as much time as I would have liked. And again, it has a lot of subtlety. It doesn't directly explain to you every single thing unless it feels that it needs to. And if it does it doesn't do it in a very stupid hand-holdy way. It does it in the awesome Patrick Stewart voice of Charles Xavier. And in that notion, this movie's near perfectly casted. Hugh Jackman is not Canadian, and he's also not a very short man, but for the most part he does the job in terms of being a crazy, feral, hairy person. And this begins a kind of like Wolverine all on his own, of just being a very different kind of character into the future. But before he evolves into that, he has to be very similar enough to the comics to be basically Wolverine, this smack-talking, angry, hairy dude. And everyone else, for the most part, is also very good. Cyclops and Jean Grey are, again, not as much into the characters as they probably should be. They'll be better in the next one, but they basically are the same kind of character. Cyclops is that very stern leader, but also pretty insecure and not too good at trying to hide that fact. And Jean Grey is this person who really has to deal with her emotions and her insecurities and her ability to not really be sure on where she's going to go with her life. Not much of that is shown, but they have the glimpses of those characters from the comics in this. And again, the best of them is Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart. They are perfect casting of these two people. I don't want to see any other person. Like, I don't think that we should necessarily bring these movies into the canon of the MCU, but just bring these actors back. Also, give them like a youth serum so they never die, please, because they need to be these characters forever. Just forever, because they're fantastic. And that's mainly due to the way that they're written. Again, the most important characters get the best screen time and the best development to really show off who they are, to really give you a great introduction to the series. I would have loved if he kept writing for the series. Ultimately, he doesn't write after X2. He does write for the next one, but after that it's completely David Hayter-less. He goes on to other stuff, which is very unfortunate because he definitely knew these characters. He just needed a little bit more time with certain other characters to definitely get more into them. X-Men ultimately is a team book, and it needed to really have more time to bring these characters together and really emphasize them before it went more into the team aspects of it, which of course the next one does. So in terms of being an introduction to the team in and of itself, this definitely does a really good job in showing everything good you need to know about the characters. All except Storm. Halle Berry is not a fantastic actress. It's just, in general, she can be really good, but I've seen several movies where she's not fantastic. She's better in 2 and 3, but she is not good. She's not even all here, you know? She just feels like she's just reading off her lines. She's very disinterested, especially when the worst line in the whole series. What happens when a toad gets struck by lightning? Same thing that happens to everything else. What a stupid line. My only real problems with this movie is that Bryan Singer is definitely not a fantastic action director. He was better when he was a little bit more subtle dramas like in The Usual Suspects. because due to the fact that they have a little bit too much wires with people jumping around and being flipped over during the fights, the fight scenes are not fantastic. They're not my favorite parts of the movie. My favorite parts of the movie are the very subtly shot, very closed in, very homey feel of the expansion scenes. Everything looks really great, and how I'd imagine the real world version of that whole house would look like. I love the set design, and I love the way Bryan Singer really shows off the characters. And double goes for the crazy Magneto areas, wherever that is. I think Rikers Island, sure. He just really brings out the emotion in these scenes, and added with the really good acting of people like Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart, you get some really great scenes that really bring these characters to life. But the action scenes, oh boy, no. Due to the fact that, again, crazy, bad wire action, not too bad, not the worst I've seen, but it's pretty obvious and it doesn't look all that great. The only real action part I liked is the Wolverine versus Mystique fight. That looks pretty good due to the way it was edited and the fact that it's a little bit closed in due to wherever they were at the Statue of Liberty. And the fact that it kind of used of the, oh, which Wolverine is it? That was pretty cool. Really didn't like the Toad fight, and I really didn't like the Sabretooth fight. Wolverine gets easily murked by Sabretooth, and he has to barely defeat him using Cyclops' blast. Like, okay. Also, that shot where he gets thrown off and then, like, slingshots himself with his claw breaks reality. That's not how physics work. That's not how Wolverine's claws would work. And a few of these, like, wire stunts were definitely, like, sped up. Like, they were very clearly done in regular speed, and they were sped up, and that's a little bit obvious. It's not too bad. It's, again, not the worst I've seen in terms of that, like, clear sped up action, you know? It's not like it's Twilight, but it's there, and it is pretty noticeable. But these not that great editing choices and the not fantastic fight scenes are not the majority of the movie, and they don't really ruin the movie for me. Again, I really like these characters. I really like the way they were written. I like the way this movie is paced. I really like the acting and casting choices, for the most part, of these characters. It isn't great, doesn't go too deep into the characters, doesn't expand them as much as I would have wanted, but it definitely is a really good introduction to the X-Men as characters for the general public that probably knew maybe a little bit about the X-Men, watching at some point at that point, I think still current ongoing X-Men cartoon. Majority of people's exposure to X-Men, and it was a really good exposure. It's aged a little bit in terms of its effects and the way it's shot, because obviously that, like, quick edits and the way they have their wire fu is very because they wanted to bank on the way that The Matrix was doing. Not only does that not look fantastic, but it's aged a little bit. It doesn't ruin the movie. The reason I think I would definitely want to give it a medium well. Not a well done, but I feel like it's a very fun movie that definitely you could possibly have a very, very great movie. I'll definitely be talking about all of the weird, crazy choices that went into making the series the way it eventually became. With, of course, next time I'll be talking about X2, the sequel to X-Men, which people hold in very high regard. Is it as great as people say it is? Probably. X2 is the other movie I grew up with, so I'll be very glad to get into that. But until then, I've been the Movie-a-thoner. If you enjoyed this review, then go ahead and subscribe. Again, I got X2 coming out, and I got a whole bunch of other reviews on my channel. Did you like X-Men, or do you think it's worse than any other movie you've ever thought? Well then, leave that stuff in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. But most importantly, stay good, stay safe. And where's my hat? I forgot to put on my hat this whole entire review. Didn't notice till right now. God dang.